Okay, so thank you all for coming. It's great to see you all, and we're happy to be here. Thank you also to Perfect Circuit for making this happen. We're excited to be part of this establishment in some form or another and show our product to you and how it works in different situations. My name is Fred. I'm from BitWig. I'm here with my colleague Klaus.
Yeah. Hello. So Fred is going to start and show like an overview of BitWig Studio and how you can integrate into a modular system. I thought I'm going to do like a small in-depth dive of the grid, what you can do, a bit more advanced sound design on it later, but let's get rocking with Fred.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm going to assume that most of you people know what a DAW is, how a DAW works. So I'm going to just go ahead and skip a couple of the details when I'm doing my presentation. If there's anything that's unclear, or any comments or questions that you might have, just raise your hand or stomp your feet or do something and ask your questions. I should mention, we have swag, we have bags, t-shirts, 8-track cards, you already seen this. The t-shirts we're going to give out to the best questions. So that's an incentive for you guys to ask questions. And by the end of the presentation, we're going to do the raffle. We're going to roll that thing around and grab something out of it, and the lucky number will receive a full version of BitWig Studio, or a full license, I should say. Yeah, so let's get started. Like Klaus said, I'm going to do like a very brief intro to BitWig Studio, the different aspects of the software, just to give you like a background when I'm showing you things. I'm kind of new into this whole Eurorack mess, but I've been doing it for a while, and I really enjoy working with modular synthesizers, and I think BitWig Studio does a great job integrating into that world. So that's what I'm going to show. Fan stopped, great. So, so that's what I'm going to focus on a lot today. And if I get things right, I think I'm in the right place for that. I have, well, of course, a computer running BitWig Studio. I have well, it's not really a small Eurorack system, is it? It's a medium-sized Eurorack system. But I'm just going to use a few parts of this to show you a couple of different techniques that I use myself when I make music, because I like to use BitWig Studio as my sequencer, as my DAW, as my beating heart, and I want to generate and do crazy things with the hardware stuff here. But we'll get back to that. So let's start here. Let's see if we get some sound. Yeah, we're not going to listen to the whole thing. But I'm using this demo project just to show you a couple of different things that's going on. I hope you can see all right, if I'm not standing in the way. Of course, what you're looking at is a timeline, an arrangement, with a bunch of different clips. You'll have some note clips. You'll have no audio here, actually. OK, well, we can get to that. On the left-hand side, we have our clip launcher, which is a non-linear kind of workspace where you can launch scenes and clips and work with it without having to worry about an arrangement. So I'm just going to turn the volume back up and I'll show you how that would work. So right now, everything is playing from the timeline, right? There are no clips in the clip launcher that are active. So you'll notice when I launch something from the clip launcher that things happen. So I can launch individual clips, and they will sync up to the master tempo, and you'll see that the tracks, the timeline material here is grayed out, meaning that's bypassed. Let me launch a scene like this. Now everything is grayed out from the timeline. I'm only playing from the clip launcher. I can use these buttons here to go back to the timeline. And you'll see that I can freely mix between the two different workflows. I can jump back and forth. I can, let one track play from the clip launcher while the other material is running in the timeline. In the demonstration with the hardware stuff, I'm probably only gonna work in the clip launcher because, I'm not gonna stand here and build like an arrangement in front of you guys. That would be awkward. So yeah, it's a great kind of workspace for sketching ideas, live performance, jamming with your friends, things like that. A word on our devices. The device panel is the bottom panel that you see. That's changing when I select the different tracks. That's where most of the action is going to happen tonight, except for the hardware part. In the device panel, I have my devices. In this case, it's a synthesizer. It's a polysynth, one of our flagship instruments, followed by some audio effects. And that's how the signal flow goes. It goes from left to right. So you usually place an instrument in the front, followed by audio effects. You can also use things like note effects. So if I want to add an arpeggiator, I can add that in front of the polysynth, and that will affect the notes coming into the instrument. Any questions so far? No? Brilliant. So modulation is a huge part of BitWig Studio, and I think we do it really well. It's one of my favorite features of BitWig Studio. It's super simple to add modulation to sounds. And what I'm going to do to show you is, first of all, I'm going to create a new track. This, by the way, is our pop-up browser. You'll see that come back and forth when I'm adding things. You don't have to worry about all the functionalities. I personally like to use the search. So whenever I bring this pop-up browser up and I say I want to add a polysynth, I would just type in POLY, select the polysynth, bam, and it's added to my project. So modulation. This is the most basic patch you can imagine. This is our 2-oscillator subtractive synthesizer. You'll notice it has 2 sections here. These are the oscillators. You'll have a filter section. You'll have 2 envelopes. Oh, this is the filter section. 2 envelopes, nothing else. And the philosophy, or kind of the philosophy is the right word I'm looking for, of BitWig Studio is to keep things simple and modular. So these are kind of the simple building blocks. There are no audio effects here. There's no Lfos or crazy step sequencers or anything. But I can add that super easy. And the power is in how I can build these simpler building blocks together in something meaningful and interesting. So just to play a simple chord. So this is the most simple synth sound you can imagine, and I'm going to use BitWig Studio's modulation system to create some movements here. So first of all, let's record this clip. I'm actually going to play some drums on top of that. Woo! Pretty horrible, but let's bring some movement into that, see if we can make it sound interesting. Is the volume okay? Can you hear me talk when that's okay, good. So I've just recorded a very simple chord into a clip that's running in this nonlinear fashion. I go back to my device, I go back to my polysynth. You'll notice here on the left-hand side there is a modulator panel is what we call it. So essentially every device in BitWig Studio throughout, synthesizers, audio effects, note effects, VST plugins, hardware stuff, has this modulator panel. And I can add modulators to these slots. So I'm gonna go ahead and click the plus button. You'll see a browser coming up with a selection of modulators. I'm gonna go with classic Lfo and add that to my synth. Now, excuse me, it's the damn Coke. Every modulator has this assign button, right? So when I click that, actually let me bring it down so I don't have to shout. When I click the sign button, you'll see, maybe, I hope, that the parameters turn a little bit bluish, meaning that I can start assigning. So in assign mode, I can just click and drag. Maybe you'll see how things start to move here in the background. Just gonna add a little bit of modulation. And you can see that I can add to, as many parameters, any amount, any direction, and just go a little bit crazy here. Let's see how it sounds. I can show the settings for the LFO here by clicking it. I'm gonna make it sync to my tempo. And we're starting to get somewhere, right? I can start adding more modulators. Let's grab an envelope. So I'm just gonna go ahead and add an ADSR. This is just a basic envelope, and I'm gonna assign it to the mix here, maybe. There are other things like step sequencers. Let me add a steps. And I can draw some curves in here, and I think I wanna modulate the pitch. So we're getting places, and that's just a very brief kind of scratching the surface of what the modulation system can do. I can cross-modulate. I should show you that too. So let me go ahead and add a second LFO. Unfold the first LFO and modulate the speed, maybe. So, are we playing? Yeah, so that's just a demonstration to show you how modulators work in BitWig Studio, and I'm going to use that later in my hardware setup to modulate stuff in this world and vice versa. So what's next? Is there anything else we should cover before we start doing the hardware thing? Yes? That really depends on the computer you have. Yeah. So, I mean, we only provide the software, and you can, in theory, add as many instruments, as many VST plugins, as many samples as you like, and depends on your system. Moving on. So, getting into the hardware thing. This is a set of different tools and devices that we provide that speak hardware, essentially. Actually, before we go into that, let me just show you one detail here on the setup on the hardware side. If you can see what's the modules on the right, my right, your right as well. This is a USB audio interface. It's an ES8 made by Expert Sleepers. It's essentially a USB, class-compliant USB audio interface, 8 outputs, 4 inputs. You can extend it using LightPipe, and it's built in a Eurorack format, so it really fits nicely into this kind of setup. The outputs and inputs are DC coupled, meaning that I can use this to send out CV, gate, clock, and all that. And I should mention also that, well, essentially CV and audio are interchangeable. So it doesn't really matter if I'm sending out audio or CV, it just matters on where I put it, and the effect will be different. I'm using the first 2 outputs here as my main audio coming from the project, and I'm sending, well, yeah, I'm sending stuff back into the audio ports in 1 and 2, so I can't really see that, can you? Well, so I can record whatever I'm doing here into my project at BitWig Studio. So essentially, I have 6 more outputs that I can do whatever I want with, and 2 inputs. So let's use that. So I'm gonna go ahead and add a CV instrument. This is my device to, what's the word I'm looking for? Translate essentially note information in BitWig Studio to CV and gate. And I'm gonna do that by, I've actually cheated and prepared a clip. So I don't have to actually record anything while you're watching. I like to work in the privacy of my own space. So I'm just gonna drag that into the clip launcher. Let me see, the drum beat is soloed, and we should be getting some sound when I click play. But before that, I need to assign where to send out pitch and gate. So in the hardware CV instruments, I have the selection here for the hardware outputs. This is something that I've set up in the audio settings, by the way. I'm gonna use mono 3 for my pitch out. And again, you probably can't see that, but this port is now got a nice blue color showing me that something is happening. I'm gonna connect pitch out number 3 into the 1 volt per octave input on the oscillator. And then it's time to send some gate information as well. That's gonna be number 4. And this will send triggers to the envelope generator that's gonna open up the VCA here. Again, this is all assuming that you know a little bit about how Eurorack modular synthesis works. If you have any questions, then go ahead and ask. But let's see what happens when I play something here. So we're probably gonna get the drum beat from the project that's playing, and we're gonna get the synth sound from this world here, the oscillator through a filter, through a VCA, opened by the envelope. And these are, of course, the notes that I've, prepared in my note clip from before. And it sounds a little bit groovy. That's because the drum beat is not perfect on the beat, but don't worry, it's supposed to be that way. It's perfectly synced up, it's super tight. And there's no MIDI at all involved here. This is all happening in the audio realm. This is all happening, in the audio engine kind of universe. Yes? Yes. You can store settings in clips, but for this demonstration, it's only notes. It's just basic note. If I were to, let's say, if I go back to the track I was working on before, and I have my clip that I recorded, I can just drag that into the browser, and you'll see that I can store the device with the clip. I can store all sorts of data, and then I can totally recall that at any point in other projects, and that will live in my library. Yeah. You can. I don't think is there a physical limit? 192 or 256? Yeah. So if you have a huge rig with a massive amount of in and out, you can do that in BitWig Studio as well. We support that. So where was I? Yes. Now, as you may heard, or as you maybe know, analog oscillators are kind of dumb. They don't know what a note is. They don't know that I'm sending C4 or whatever. They just get some kind of electricity, and they spit out another kind of electricity. So what I can do is I can tune it and help BitWig Studio play the right notes to the oscillator so it knows what to play. I'm going to use a auxiliary or a secondary output of the oscillator and send it back into BitWig Studio. So I'm using a triangle waveform from the oscillator, sending it to an input in my audio interface. Lower the volume here so we don't hear it too loud. choosing which output that is from my chooser in the CV instrument. And you'll hear, probably not, because the drum beat is soloed. Yeah, that's nice. And essentially, I can start this tuning process, and essentially what's happening is that BitWig Studio plays back some 10 octaves or something to the oscillator and analyzing what's coming back, and from that, drawing a curve that's, if all goes right, means that my oscillator is now playing in tune. Once I've done that, I can remove the connection again, and let's kill this, no input, and let's play back and see what happens. So. That sounds better. Now the oscillator is tuned up, and I have a melody that's, in theory, is in tune with my project. I didn't mention that I have a Midi keyboard here, actually. Maybe I can just for demonstration purposes, play. Yeah, so if I have a Midi keyboard, I could have, of course, have just played a melody on my Midi keyboard, recorded that, and used that as my clip. But I don't play really. I just program stuff and hope for the best. That's how I make music. But yeah, maybe some of you can relate. So when I've done that, that's essentially the most basic, simple setup that you can imagine. It's just pitch and gate. And that's not, so much fun, is it? We need more stuff. We want to bring movement into our sound. I can, again, coming back to the philosophy of BitWig Studio being, keep everything simple and combine stuff. So you don't have additional outputs, you don't have a clock, you don't have envelopes, you don't have all that. But it's so easy to add. We don't need to have it here. We don't need to clutter the interface with stuff. We can just add it. So inside this device, I'm going to add an additional output, and I'm just adding a hardware CV out device. Number 5 is available, so I'm just going to choose mono 5 here. This is mono out 5. I'm going to connect that to the cutoff CV input of the filter. And let's see what happens. Now I have software control of the hardware filter, meaning that I can just fool around with the mouse, click it. I can record, I can do automation, I can do all sorts of arrangement in the computer, controlling the hardware filter, and then record it back in. Or I can, of course, use the excellent modulation system of BitWig Studio. So I'm just going to open the Modulator Panel, insert an Lfo. I'm going to make this Lfo free running and click the assign button and assign it. And as easy as that, I can start adding modulation to my hardware. Let's add something more. Let's add a random modulator, randomly changing the speed of the Lfo for every bar. So the implications of this is who needs hardware modulators? You can just sell them, throw them out. You have everything in the box. And since we're working in the audio realm, we don't have any media or anything, meaning that means that I can do things like audio rate modulation. So let's try that. So what would you like to FM? Any suggestions? What's a typical thing to frequency modulate? The oscillator? Oscillator pitch. I heard oscillator pitch in the back. Okay, let's do that. So I have several ports available here, so I'm not too familiar with this oscillator, but I think FM1 is probably a good place to insert that. And let's add, as we do, one more CV out to our chain. Let's open the modulator panel, add an LFO. Because as you know, an LFO is just a low frequency oscillator, but in our case, we don't have to have it in low frequency, we can have it in the kilohertz range. So if I start modulating here, you'll probably see, I hope, behind me, you see some crazy waveform happening there. I didn't choose the output. No wonder. So, what did I say, number 6? Yep. I kind of like that. Let's say I want to record this. I'm going to go ahead and add an audio track. I'm going to choose my stereo in 1 and 2. I'm going to mute it so I don't get the sound back out again. Arm it. You'll see there's some input going on, and that's the whole hardware thing here. And let's record. So I'm cutting out the volume from the hardware oscillator, and I'm gonna play back what I just recorded in the hope that it sounds the way it should. Again. So there's something in German called the Vorführ effect, meaning the demo effect, that whenever you're trying to demonstrate something, you're bound to get weird results. So that's a weird result, but let's play it again from the top. Okay, now it's in time. So what I did is I just did a take. I just played, noodled for a little while and got this loop going on. And that's usually how I work, and I hear that a lot, that people who use Eurorack, they noodle for hours, record for hours, and then cut out the nice parts. And that's what we can do now. Again, this is an advantage of working in the clip launcher. I don't have to have a timeline to worry about. I can just let this thing loop as long as I want and record it for as long as I want. Hopefully, yes, please. Yes. You can also record on the timeline. Yes, absolutely. I just like to record in the clip launcher myself, so I'm a bit biased. But absolutely, you can record in the timeline as well. If you don't like to use the clip launcher, you can just hide it, essentially. Or, yeah, use the both. I believe you were first, yes? Is there a way to set the length of your clip? Yes. Let me open up the play menu here. We have something called post-recording action. I can set this to do anything I want after a set time. So if I set it to play recorded, I can set a number of bars here, 4 bars, meaning that if I record a clip, After 4 bars, it will just play back what I just recorded. Or I can go ahead and record into next free slot, meaning that I can, start recording in one clip after a set amount of bars, just the next one, next one, next one, next one. There is no audio overdub in that sense. Do you want to destroy it? I don't know. Yeah. You mean like a new take? Forget the I'm not sure. Actually, what I would do is I would just record into the next one, and then I can just go back and remove whatever I don't need. 'Cause I don't know about you guys, but I do get a lot of material that I never use. So just to show you another kind of typical thing that I would do after doing this recording. Or sorry, you had a question as well. Yes. Yes. Let's do exactly that. So you'll notice that in the clip launcher, I'm in the audio editor right now, below. I'm not bound, as it were. I'm not stuck with, excuse me, I'm not stuck with the audio material that I just graded. I'm free to do edits here. So let me show you what I mean. I can duplicate this. This is now my super long clip. I can, of course, make shorter loops and say, okay, this is the stuff that I want to keep. I can do cuts. I'm just going to select the knife tool and cut this up a little bit randomly. Let's say that, okay, this part wasn't so good, so I can just remove that. And this part was really good, so I want to loop that for a couple of takes or a couple of events. We call them audio events, by the way. These are all like individual events now. But you asked, I believe, how to kind of take that into the timeline, into the arrangement. So let's do that. I'm just going to drag it over here. I need to zoom in a bit so I can see more. And if I click this button, it will play back from the timeline. I'm gonna loop this particular part. So the drum beat is playing from the clip launcher, and the synth part is playing from the timeline. You notice that these are just this is just a short selection or a section that I cut out and duplicated to loop it up. But if I want to, I can of course do other things. I can say, okay, wait a minute, this was way better. Let's jump there. Okay, this was. I also perform at children parties, by the way. That was a cheap joke. But anyway, so pitch, format, stretching are all things that I can do in the audio editor. And if I select here, I have, if you can see that here, a bunch of different expressions that I can select and work with. That gives me access to a way to edit or change the pitch of individual events like I'm doing here. I can also do individual stretch things, so let's stretch this last section. Yeah. The clip launcher? No. This is all kind of just the way I left it. I just dragged it over to make a copy of it, and it doesn't affect, they don't affect each other. That way I have like a safety copy of my, yeah. Mm-hmm. What was the question? Yeah. I'm not sure I understand the question. Not necessarily. We also do session recordings, meaning that, let's see, I'm just gonna move the playhead to an empty part of my timeline. Just gonna arm or hit record and launch a scene. Oops. So what I just did there was a session recording, just a very quick take, and whatever I played on the clip launcher was recorded into the timeline. So that's like one workflow that I also do is I start in the clip launcher and build a bunch of different loops and different variants of that, hit record and just do a take of my song. Yes, absolutely. So let me find an empty scene here. Just gonna create 2 more scenes. I'm gonna make a time selection of the whole time that I recorded and drag it into a scene, and it's now inside my clip launcher, ready for action. All right, any more questions that yeah? Yes. So the pitch is what's called an audio expression, and that's not really recordable in that sense, but I can, right? Huh? Thanks. But I can do edits, and I can draw automation with it, or of it. Yes, please. Absolutely. So that could be something I could show you next. Let's see if you have a question for. Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. I don't have like a launch pad or anything here, but that's usually that's the way to go. So we do support, any kind of out of standard MIDI controller out of the box launch pads. What's the other one? APC 40. Yeah, whatever. Yeah. Yes. No, exactly. And that's a really cool thing, that you can kind of stay in the clip launcher, do your edits. It doesn't matter how long it is, how many different events you have. You can do all the work in the clip launcher. You can even, I'm now back in my original clip that I recorded. Let's say it's a drum beat or whatever, and I want to exchange like a snare. I can even drag in like other audio samples into my clip. Let's see if you can see that here. So you can do things like cutting out certain section, replacing them with other things. That's a feature to be discussed after the after the show. You can of course do automation, meaning that you can just bring in an effect in the device panel just on that part. Mm-hmm. There is a global undo. It's meaning that if you do lots of crazy things here and then you go away and do other things, you'll have to go back to full kind of full undo history. However, let's see here. So let's say I have this part and I cut out this section, remove it, and then no, actually I wanna keep it. I can just drag it out, and it will just be, you know, because the audio that I recorded is always gonna be the same. So these are non-destructive edits essentially. What I do is I just create a bunch of, you know, copies of the same clip, and I try out different things, and yes, sure. So if you look here, this is the region that's actually playing, but I just did an edit over here. So this is also like a place or a space where you can store stuff for later also. The clip launcher can be used for that. You know, if I have a crash sample that I just want to bring in like a few times in my project, I'll just store it, as it were, in the clip launcher to just kind of, okay, here I can drag it in, here I can drag it in. So, yes, modulating stuff in BitWig Studio using hardware. So let's do that next. Before that, I'm going to remove the frequency modulation because it's a little bit too crazy. And going to bring it back just to the beat. How does this sound now? Oops, excuse me. So we still have this simple synth voice happening. I've removed the frequency modulation to make it a little bit more clear. I can do extra kind of modulation things on top of that. I can, of course, use hardware Lfos, as I would do normally to control things. So let's replace a software Lfo with a hardware Lfo. This Lfo is a quad pingable Lfo, meaning that it needs a clock or a tap to start working. And of course, whenever I tap something, it's always going to be on time, always. But just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to clock it using BitWig Studio instead. And I'm using the ping input of this Lfo, and I'm using an available output from BitWig Studio. Going back into the software world, looking at what we have here. Just going to go ahead and hide that for now. I'm going to add a clock output module called the hardware clock out, and that does exactly what the name suggests. The number 7 is what I choose to send out a clock, and when I so this isn't in any way limited, of course, to Lfos. This can be your sequencer. This can be, you know, anything that accepts clock input. And what if we would, as our guest kindly asked about, what if we want to modulate the software? So we're going to use the same Lfo. I'm going to take this out from the filter, and I'm going to send it back into BitWig Studio. And let's return to our friend, the polysynth. Let's see. This is a totally different tone, so I'll remove the synth for now. And we have all these crazy modulations happening. I'm gonna go ahead and remove that for now. and add a hardware CV in modulator. This is, again, a very simple modulator. I can choose the input, and it's number 4. And I'm not sure if you can see this, but there's a red kind of line here showing me that something is coming in through this hardware port. And of course, I can assign this to anything. I choose the cutoff of the filter. So that's a fun way to kind of cross-pollinate the two worlds together, sending modulation out, sending stuff out, but also bringing stuff in, sending clock out to sync up a hardware LFO that in turn controls a software synthesizer. Where are we in time? In space? I'm hitting quarter of an hour. Now, this is all happening in the device panel, as it were, kind of this level of putting software synths, actually I didn't show you VST plugins yet, but I think I'm gonna skip that. But anything I've done here with our internal synthesizer, you can also do with VSTs. There's also a deeper level in BitWig Studio, which is released with version 3 that came out last year, and that's called the Grid. The Grid is our modular sound design environment, and it's essentially 2 plugins, if you will, that we develop. One is called Polygrid. Just gonna go ahead and open that up. And it's environment, a patchable environment where you can build things like instruments, audio effects, all sorts of things. This is the most basic. This is the init patch. Let me see if I can get some sounds out of this thing. Yep. This is just an oscillator going into an envelope, going to the audio out. In the Grid, you have some 160 different modules that you can build things from. You have all sorts of different oscillators. You have all sorts of filters, things to build complex patches, math, logic. I don't know half these things, but you know, some people more talented than myself build really amazing advanced patches from this. Klaus, my colleague, is going to show you a little bit of more like how to build crazy synthesizers and things in a second. I just want to touch on how to use this to work with the hardware, because that's my forte. And let's say I want to have a filter in this software patch that I have. I can, of course, use a software filter. I can just drag a filter module into the patch. That's one way to do it. But being a hardware fanatic, it's kind of fun also to use a hardware filter, right? So let's remove the software filter. And, ooh, this is all crazy kabel salat. I'm sending out all sorts of things here. I'm just going to go ahead and remove that so I don't confuse myself. I see that there's a lot of action happening in the background. I need to disable the other tracks so I don't get any interference. Now. Yeah. Now I have in the in-out category something that's called hardware in, hardware out. I have CV in, CV out, CV pitch out, meaning that I can use this modular environment to, you know, control things in the hardware world and vice versa. And what I wanted to show you is a very simple kind of patch on how you can use a hardware filter in a software patch. So I've added an output and an input. I'm sending the output from the oscillator to a hardware output. Let's choose number 3 that's available. And let's bring back the sound into the Grid through input number 3. And patch that into the envelope. Should be easy enough. And using my patch cables, I have an option to patch things up. So let's see. Bob's your uncle. And I can now, you know, because analog filters are, of course, way better than digital filters. And yeah, that's just one very simple way to do it. If I want to do things like modulation, I can do that here as well. So let's add a software. Let me hide this part so we get more space. Add an Lfo module from the grid. You'll see that it's a fairly simple module again with yeah, some waveform settings and speed and range. No, actually no range. We have to add that if we want that. Again, going back to the I/O category, let's add a CV out module. And number 4 is available. I'm going to patch that up as such. And the output 4 goes into the CV input of my filter. Yeah, so that's just a very simple demonstration on how to send audio in and out and how to send modulation out. Let's send modulation back in. I'm gonna use the trusted old Lfo again. The output from the Lfo goes to an input in the audio interface, and let's control pitch. Again, under in out, I'm choosing CV in, choosing my input, number 4. Actually, this is a small detail, but it's really handy. In all these choosers, you actually see some volume meters. So you see, okay, there's something happening that I'm probably on the right place. It's, you know, small details, but these things actually help. So patching this up to the pitch of the oscillator. Beautiful. Sound design in a box or in 2 boxes. So that's an interesting way to kind of, you know, use all the different components together. Let's try something else, but for that I'm gonna start over again. Yes. It's exactly the lag that you set in your audio settings. So open up the settings real quick under audio. I can set a block size or a buffer size. In this case, I'm running at 256 samples. So that's the lag. And again, that depends on your system, how fast of a computer you have, what kind of audio interface you have, and so on. Now, actually, I should mention now that since we have hardware stuff involved in our software patch, if we want to record that or export that, we need to do real-time recording, because, of course, a computer doesn't know what's happening here. But that's just a matter of recording exactly the way that I showed you earlier. Mm-hmm. Yes, with some limitations. In the grid, this modular sound design environment, there are no MIDI in and out at this point. But if you're working in what I showed you before, working with these CV instruments and stuff, there are also, just very quickly, a hardware instrument which is essentially the same but with MIDI. Well, it's not the same, but it's it serves the same purpose, but with MIDI. And here you would select your outputs, I don't have a MIDI thing going on here, but essentially this is how you do it. An interesting kind of bonus point to that is that the way that I worked with CV outputs, you can work almost the same with CC. So you can load like a CC device, and this gives you 8 different CC outputs that you can freely kind of set. Let's say CC 7, 43, and 62, and 127. I can now control all the CCs, for my hardware synth. If 8 is not enough, I'll just go ahead and add more. That's not a problem. Exactly. So I can open up the modulator panel for the CC, add an LFO, assign that to CC7, for instance. And this is actually great because I have an old virtual analog Clavia Nord-Lead synthesizer, and time syncing the LFO on that thing is just hard. So I don't even need to do that. I can just do it here in BitWig Studio. And I've actually created a preset for my Nord-Lead, which with all these like CC devices set up, I've set them up the way I want them. I've created a bunch of what we call remote controls, which are essentially shortcuts to like favorite parameters. I can save all this as a preset, bring it up into my project whenever I'm working, and start playing, and I have access to all the parameters of the hardware synthesizer straight in here. Not only that, I also have a flush button. And when I hit the flush button, all the current values from here will be sent to my hardware synthesizer. So in essence, I have like a preset management system in BitWig Studio, and I can like instantly recall hardware presets through here without having to worry about touching that thing. Yes. Well, not through MIDI at this point. We might expand on the capabilities of the grid to send out CC and MIDI and so on. Another thing that I wanted to demonstrate real quick, which I think is cool. I'm just gonna set this up real quick so that we can get like a very simple synthesizer voice playing. So bear with me for just a second. So wait a second. This is going from the oscillator in to the filter. I want to trigger the envelope from BitWig Studio. So I need to remove all this junk. Actually, it's probably easier to just re-add. Now, where was I? Yes. Trigger the envelope, the hardware envelope from the grid. That's going to open up the VCA to play the synth voice. Now, for that, I will need a hardware output, and I will need something to send trigger signals. The output that I'm using is number 3, yes. And I'm using what's called a gates module, sending out gate signals. So let's see if we get some sounds. There is some effects happening here, by the way. There's a delay module here. Let's keep it a bit drier. So what I'm doing here is I just have a small, very simple gate sequencer inside the grid, triggering the envelope on the hardware side. Let me actually go ahead and remove all the other things. So the grid is open in the sense that I don't have to build a synthesizer. I don't have to build like some sound generator. I can simply use it as a way to control my hardware, like in this case. Let's add a second hardware output. I'm going to use number 4. Let's add a pitch sequencer. And I'm gonna send that out to control the pitch of my oscillator. Yes, hit record already. And the way that timing actually works in the grid is really interesting. We're using phase. We're not using pulses or clocks or anything like that. We're using phase. And phase means essentially it's a curve. And if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see a yellow curve, a ramping curve going from 0 to 1, essentially. And 0 is the beginning and 1 is the end. And this is great because we can do a lot of things to bend time, as it were. Under the phase category, I'm going to insert a bend module. Whoops. Actually, I have to set it up a bit differently. I need to choose the... That's how to do it. Now, if I bend time, I get these kind of effects, which are, it's fun to work with. Yeah, I can actually, that's a good point. Let me, well, my metronome in this case is a drum beat. So it's a really fun way to work with time and create these kind of weird, funky rhythms. Let's see what else we have here. We have, well, reverse. That's what you would expect. Oh, no, that's not what I was looking for. I was looking for mirror. Let's mirror the phase signal. So I can do like really creative, interesting edits, working with time, reversing, bending, scale it, and do all sorts of funky things. Let's see what happens if I have different phase settings for the two different sequences. And actually before, I didn't mention the step count, so I can make the sequences any amount of step, but the timing will always remain the same. So because have this, you know, this kind of ramping curve that describes the timing cycle of 1 bar in this example. The output module. No. Short answer, no. Yeah. Yes, actually, yeah, that's a good point. So any output from any module can go to 2 inputs. So I have the same settings for both. And yeah, that will of course mean that they will act, you know, they will have the same settings. What else? I'm sorry, what's the question? Mm-hmm. Playlist with playlists. How do I understand that? Is that like comping or? Okay. Yeah. No. At the moment, we don't have that feature. One way that I kind of work around that is to record in the clip launcher. So that means that I essentially could have takes, but it's instead of them being like layered like that, there's layered like that, if that makes sense. So I think that kind of concludes my part of this presentation, and I would like to invite Klaus to show you a little bit of how you can build interesting synthesizer sounds using the grid.
All right. It's,
Oh, thank you. Den röda här är volymen förresten.
Okay. Bra att veta. So, I think I'm going to start a new project, so we have some blank slate to play with. So, I'll just start by showing some stuff Frederick showed in the grid, but also a bit more, just to give you a little bit of an overview what it's about. So first off, I mean, we added this in version 3, and we had a big focus on making it really fast and easy to use. So a big deal about it is that the workflow should be really inviting, and it should be a fun sound design environment, and not so much of a like development environment. So a big part of it is like all these gestures you can use. For example, here when I drag and drop in a new module, I have all these kind of commands that I can just drop in and merge it. You saw it. I now have 2 oscillators, and I can just blend between them. These things down here are like tuning controls. So that means I can just set one of the oscillators to be like a sub-oscillators, and I can just blend between them. Another special detail in the grid is that all the signals are actually in stereo. So I can go ahead and detune one of them. And you hear that has this really wide sound already. And that even applies to things like filters. And here again, you will see the kind of gestures that I was talking about, that if we drop something on a port, the grid tries to do the most clever thing it can figure out. Like here it added the envelope on the cutoff input port. We also use a color coding system. So yellow means gate signals, purple means phase, orange means pitch, red is usually just normal audio signals, and blue is like an alternate color, but we often use it for like modulation signals. And if I now drop something on the modulation input port, I just added like phase modulation to that signal. And just as I showed you before with the envelope, if I wanted to change over time, I could just insert it like this. And so this makes it really quick to just quickly throw something together. And it's just like a fun, quick environment to play with. Now I wanted to show some special cases that are more like advanced, now that I did a simple example. So I'll start with just a sine wave. I'm going to switch this with a sine wave. And I wanted to build a little distortion. All right. So first of all, here's my effect. I'm going to add a gain control and a shaper. So to see what's happening to the signal, I'm going to add an oscilloscope and color them a little bit different. So I'm going to do like blue color in the distorted part, and red on the input. All right, so now you see how the two signals are slightly different. Like when it starts clipping, it starts to look more square. But I wanted to try a thing. I wanted the distortion to kind of like not just be flat, but actually fold back. So how would I go about and do that? Well, I can now subtract the original signal coming in from the distorted one. That basically gives me only the part that actually changed through the distortion module. And if I then add that back in to the original signal, I should get the distorted signal once. Wait a minute, something didn't add up here. It did fall back, but it folds back too much. Let's see. Distorted. Interesting. This looks like the original one. Yeah, okay. Okay, this is the one we had before. Now, if I take this subtracted signal over here, okay, maybe you didn't see how it looks, and scale this, I should be able to actually make it fall back again. So let's see if we can do that here. Level volume, here we go. Oh yeah, here we go. And of course we can do all the stuff that Frederick showed before, that we can modulate this, add Lfos and all this stuff, but it's kind of interesting that you can build your own like shapes this way. Now if I don't take a normal distortion shape, but something else like a quantizer, this allows me to like scale it from being very square, like a, or like amplify the quantization effect or lower it. So it's a kind of funny way of doing different distortion algorithms. Do you kind of get that roughly? Okay. All right. Then I'm going to show you something else, which is Frederick showed you a lot of what you could do with phase, but phase is also really fun to do when you're using oscillators. So I'm going to, instead of using this sine oscillator, I'm going to use a phaser. A phaser is essentially the same thing as an oscillator, but except of giving you a waveform, it just gives you a phase signal between 0 and 1. So doing the same thing here that we did before, getting an oscilloscope. I'm going to fold this back so we see more. Okay, and I add it here. We'll now see that, okay, this is kind of static. This is just showing me the phase signal. If I now add a data lookup, which is essentially just taking the phase signal and bringing me a waveform, you see that, okay, it looks like a sine wave again. This is because the phase signal goes out here, and for each position in the phase, there's a specific value that the sine wave has. Now, given this, I can actually modify the phase signal as it comes. So I can add like a phase bend operation, which allows me to bend the phase and use this to create different waveforms. There's, for example, another one which like I can mirror the waveform, so it goes both ways. And as I said before, all waveforms are in stereo, so you can also make it really wide. And I can add things like a sync control, which then syncs this waveform before. And by ordering these modules in different orders, you can create all kind of totally different sounds. And of course, instead of a sine wave, I could add something else. I could say, okay, I want a triangle instead. It kind of works the same way. Okay? Now you might ask yourself, okay, how could I use this as an effect instead of a synthesizer? Well, let's try that. Okay. Okay, I have my triangle wave. Skew it a little to get some effects. Nice. Now I'm adding back the FX grid. All right, here we go. So I'm going to try to build a pitch shifter. So anyone knows how to build a pitch shifter from basic components? Well, okay, I'll show you. So first of all, we're going to have a delay line. So I'm going to grab a modulate, which is our delay, which has a fixed time. I'm going to start with sort of like 30 milliseconds, I guess. And that's a modulation input. So that means that I can modulate the delay line. And I'm going to start with an Lfo. So now this clock module. So this clock has a phase output like this. And if I use that to modulate the delay line, it's going to essentially play it slower. Except there's one problem, this jump. This jump is going to make it click, but I'm going to show you how to get rid of that later. So connect this here. You hear that it's going to change the pitch of it, but there's this click at the end. Okay, the way to get around this click is to actually create two different delay lines and then create what you, like in DSP speech, call a window. A window is essentially a signal. Actually, instead of saying what a window is, I'm just going to show you what it is. So here I'm going to take a window. I have my phase input, and now I just need to load my oscilloscope so you can see what it's doing. So, oscilloscope. Here's the clock. Make it go slow. One is good to learn. Okay. You see here. So you hear that the window goes up and down, but it's always at 0 at the point where the phase jumps back to 1. That means that if I multiply something with this, I'm actually not going to hear this click. So I'm just going to do that now. I'm going to take here a math module and multiply, add it here, add window as the second input. And now you hear, okay, you actually don't hear the click anymore. You hear that it's a different pitch, but the click is gone. But now instead of the click, you get this tremolo effect. So how can I get rid of this tremolo effect? Well, I can add a second delay line and offset it by 50% in phase, or 180 degrees if you will. So I'll just drag it here, copy all these modules. I'll now take the phase. Let's see here, we want to shift it by 50%. There we go. Use this for the window and also use it for the modulation, and we want the input as well. And then I need to add these two signals together, so which control. All right. So now actually here it sounds like a pitch shifter. I mean, it's not really precise or hitting in a specific pitch, but it's clearly a different tone than it was before. So, any more questions? Any more challenges? Yes? Yeah? No, just resources. Like, so. Is that yes? Yeah, you just save this as a preset, just like any other device. You just drag it over, give it a name. Hello, this is my pitch shifter. Yeah. And it's there. It's just a file in your user documents, and you can just drag it over. Yep. And what? Yeah, FM you can do, yes. I mean, I actually showed you a little bit before. Let's see here. Okay, let's get rid of him again. Like, I'm going to switch this to a sine wave, just to make it a bit clearer. We're going to add now a display, so I see what's happening. Fold this back. All right, so okay, this is just a simple sine. Now, essentially, I mean, frequency modulation, it either means one of two things. Either it's true frequency modulation, where we actually modulate the frequency, but most of the time it's actually phase modulation, like DX7, it's actually just modifying the phase because it means that the pitch won't drift when you change anything. So if I connect this to the orange one, you get frequency modulation. If you do that, then it starts drifting off and does weird things. But if I connect it to the phase input, it just stays here and modifies the waveform. And now if I start changing like the tuning ratios of this guy, you hear that the waveform starts looking different. And this is the point where it's really convenient for me just drop in a different envelope here. And you will have like this kind of sound where it changes over time. Yeah, so that's like the basics of phase modulation here inside the grid. Yes? There is a simple recording device. It's quite a rough around the edges, but we're probably gonna improve on it later or do a more advanced one. Where is it actually? I don't remember. It's in delay. I mean, you can always use delay lines to do things like just storing stuff in a buffer, but there's this recorder module that you can use to like trigger the recording action versus the play action. So like if you just want to do a small recording of something. But quite often you can also use like just a delay buffer and start writing stuff in it, and then just like by controlling the amount of feedback. Let's see if I go to the mixer category. Like by controlling the blend, you can then decide if, okay, do I actually want to hear the input, or do I just want it to keep on looping? So you can often just like sequence this parameter in this kind of configuration to just keep it rolling. Like if you want to do like a beat repeat effect or this kind of thing. Yeah. This module, I don't know. Maybe it's in the help. I can show you how the help view works actually, because it's really special. If I click help here, it doesn't say how long it is. But the help view is actually quite useful, because the help view shows you in the context where you are at what the current parameters are. And this is actually the real instance of the device you're connected. So if you change some kind of options on it, you're gonna get exactly what it's there, and you can just use it. And speaking of synth stuff, I mean, let's say you have something like this. You can also use the gate inputs to do like sync, and I mean, there's a lot of. Let's say connect this guy. So I mean, this is nice feature with the grid is also that everything is like running at 4 times audio rate, so you have quite a lot of like headroom to play with in terms of like phase modulation and that before it starts like aliasing too much. So yeah. Actually, inside the grid, everything is actually working on the sound card buffer size. So there's no like one sample latency delays available. If you want to make a feedback connection, you have to go over this long delay, which is a little bit longer. But it is actually quite interesting to use in quite a lot of cases. I'm going to show you a different example. So I'm adding a new polygrid. Just starting out. Add a sine wave because it's the purest. I'm now adding it, changing this to 880. Okay, so I start hitting a few notes. I'm now adding the long delay here. I'm gonna take the output of the AD and feed it back to the phase modulation input. It's kind of nice that it's like starts evolving in that way. That it just keeps growing. And if I make this parameter longer, it's kind of like a nice alternative. But our approach is kind of that each module should handle its own feedback, so we're trying to keep it contained. Yes? You can't save it as a file. We haven't built that yet. We're kind of like thinking about it, but there's not something we've done. But of course, you can save it as a preset and just copy and over, copy and paste, or drag and drop between different grid instances. So you can reuse stuff quite well. Okay. And by the way, there's also the samplers available inside the grid. So this is essentially the same sampler we have in BitWig Studio, except that you just control it like with the input signals here in this environment instead. So I can load like multi-samples inside this here. Let's see. I'm just going to grab a classic acoustic piano. And oh, sorry. Actually didn't load. What is that? This is strange. Okay, now I'm an acoustic piano. Now I can say, okay, I want to use this instead of the other one as the modulation source. Let's see how this sounds. Oh no, it should go through the delay to be a little bit more special. Or if I don't go through the delay, let's see what happens. What's kind of nice with the sampler is that it has a lot of different modes as well. I mean, the repitch is the normal sample playback mode. Cycles mode is something more like a wavetable created on the fly. It basically looks at the root key of all the sample material and then decides like, okay, where like the zero crossing is supposed to be, and lets you just play at different speeds. So if I can now like change the speed of it to make the piano evolve in a slower way. Like or I can change the format of the sound. And there's also textures mode, which is more like a classic grain sample playback, so I can control how quick it is. So, yeah, I think that's a good overview of it. Any more questions? Yes? I mean, I think I like that there's so much stuff you can do in terms of sound, and you can just play around with it, and it's just a fun environment to play with. And of course, there's nothing I don't like about it. Anyone else? Not a module, but there's the sampler, yeah. So you can use it for granular sample playback. I mean, I can also show how it looks if you use it outside of the grid, but it's pretty much the same deal. Like here's the sampler. You see it has sort of the same controls. But drop it in here. So Wurlitzer sample. I can now do this thing I did with cycles, or slow it down, or change the formats, or playing the textures mode or if you do it on a single sample, let's see, let's drag a drum loop or something here. Whatever. So if I'm repitching, hear that the pitch changes. You hear anything? If I use cycles, hear that it kind of like gets this implicit pitch because it's not like a pitch sample. And if I use textures, you can also freeze the sample. That means that instead of having a speed, you just move a playhead back and forth like that. Of course you can modulate it, yes. So you can, of course. What kind of question is that? So let's see, if I now take it random, I can just modulate the precision and say that this should have an every 16th note. So yeah, that's a yes. Yes? Yeah, sure. I mean, I can show you some of the examples we ship with the program. Like we did something. Wait a minute. What did I do here? I did the reverb. Where is the reverb? Okay. So here's, for example, like a reverb we did. So it works by having multiple. I mean, you can zoom in and out, by the way. So like has this early reflections part here, and like this bigger delay loop down here. So it creates like a full reverb that you can use. But yes, these are comments. The like explains what it is, and so you can do nice tutorials. Yeah. Yes. So I mean, that just works like any other device. I mean, these actually already have macros. So. Yeah. You just like add new page, click, wait a minute, click, 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 click. So. You can't add multiple parameters directly. What you can do is you can add one of these macro modulators. If I create one of these guys, here we go. I can now assign this like in different amounts in different directions, and I can create a remote control that points to this guy. So, and now if I right click here, wait a minute, here, I'll see that this is now you see, pointing to 3 different destinations. Or if I click here, I will also here get like a list of all the modulations that are active. So, yes. Yeah. You mean the actual movements and not the audio? No, I don't think you can. Not if it's coming from random. Yes, I mean the sound you can record. Yes. So. Yeah, except that you can't record if it's coming from modulation. If it's like a random modulator, I don't think there's. Yeah, so. Yeah. Anyone else? Or should we just continue around the pizza? All right, okay. Another one. I don't know. Me and Fredrik, we're both Swedish, so how do we know? Yeah, we're from Berlin, so okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and I guess we'll do some more beers. Yeah.